Hey everyone, this is Smith tuning into TAOTalks. Welcome to episode 5. Today we talked about the concept of exchange, ideas of, sacrifice. We then talk about different containers of our body and what it means to be operating from a spectrum of whether you're operating from a sympathetic nervous system or a parasympathetic nervous system. And, again, as a spectrum, what it means to be operating from that. And of course, when talking about that, we couldn't help ourselves, but also to continue talking about triggers. I think you're going to really enjoy it. If you stick through the entire episode and you really enjoy it, please like, comment, and share it with one of your best friends. Enjoy. This is TAOTalks. T-A-O, the art of Tao. TAOTalks, the art of exploring life. TAOTalks, the art of being. TAOTalks, philosophical musing. TAOTalks, ancient wisdom for modern beings. TAOTalks, the art of understanding. TAOTalks, universal laws. TAOTalks, timeless insights. Welcome to TAOTalks. T-A-O, the art of... Hey, Jesse.
That's it.
What's going on?
There's a question, what's going on?
Mm-hmm.
Specific to the meditation or just in general?
In general.
I want to say the busyness of life, but I'm coming off of being sick where I almost took like a week off of work. But at the same time, didn't take very much time off. You ever have one of those head colds that doesn't really take you out? Like you can still function, you can still work, you can still show up for the most part, but you're just not 100%.
You're not 100%. Yeah, I was going to say that.
And it was such an interesting thing for this particular cold because it affected my throat and my voice.
You sound back though.
I feel
compared to like Friday, even normal. Monday. Yeah.
Monday I was rough.
Yeah.
I was feeling better, but I still didn't quite have the voice.
Yeah.
Made me very aware of a few things. The power of the voice. Because when you don't have a voice, you really notice the ways in which you don't get to amplify power, not necessarily being like the ability to make other people do what you want them to do, but to have influence, to, the way you sound. If you're sick, you get care, empathy. People they respond to you differently than if you are healthy and strong. And then when you just literally don't have a voice and you can't communicate at all, then you lose that power of influence. So it made me very aware of how much of my life revolves around my voice. So much of the things that get done around me get done through the influence of my voice, to a greater degree I don't know if it's a greater degree, might be an equal degree as to the power and influence I might have of just using my hands, using my body, using my physicality. Somebody who's a manual labor, their power is going to be a lot more through their physical body than somebody like me who's a coach, who's a lot more through my voice.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot.
You've transitioned from that, right? It's like transition from your influence of your hands per se through like massage therapy and things like that to then more of through voice. I mean, even when you're guiding movement practices, I mean, it's still voice. I mean, you're using the body, but yeah.
And I think the greater...
on the receiving end, we're just hearing you and we're seeing you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're not feeling the touch, like the physical touch per se.
Well, and I'd say that's what you're seeing in that class is one of my lowest levels of influence. My greatest level of influence is in the one-on-one. sessions with clients, and we're doing that largely through Zoom. So it's almost 100% through voice. And it's not always about move this way and, cueing in the right kind of movements. A lot of it is having discussions about, how is your life organized? What, and in what ways can you change that organization of your life for better outcomes? Largely revolving around movement, developing a movement practice. But what starts with movement always influences other things as well. It's interesting. And then, and one of the things I noticed talking to clients, working with clients is there's a lot more for me to really dive into on my own on this, but I'll throw it out as a concept of the relationship of pain, and people who experience a great deal of pain and really struggle with their pain also struggle with their voice, and feeling empowered with their voice, being able to use their voice. I'll just leave it at that, to use their voice and the ways in which they use their voice. When we're in pain, we speak differently. Our voice impacts and influences people differently than when we're not in pain. And so when we struggle with our pain, and on some level, we're also struggling with feeling empowered with our voice, even recognizing that we have power, and how much of that power resides just in the voice.
I think you said when I asked you of what's going on, and I think one of the first things that came out of your mouth was something along the line of life going on, and I think that's in a way like relatable to me also, because it's just been incredibly busy. And something that stuck out to me was someone telling me and my partner like a while ago, where we weren't married yet, but we had known each other for like 5 years, and saying like, hey, you guys are just playing house. And then today I was just, that just came to me earlier this morning, because it really felt like we were like in the house. So not necessarily emphasizing on the word of playing house, but it's like, man, like we're in the midst of just like this house stuff, or like household thing. And it also goes hand in hand with the book that I'm reading that talks about hermit versus household, being hermit versus a house and household. And I think it's talking about just life experiences are actually not always by choosing the path of being a hermit. And I think it kind of goes towards what happened with us in the moment class too, where we're trying to practice something, and then there's like a I don't know, like a jackhammer going on. Yeah. And it's almost like, oh, like if you can do life when there's a metaphorical and maybe an actual jackhammer going on right next door, like maybe that's just what it is. You don't just get to be a hermit and you're like, I reside from society, or I alienate myself from society, and therefore I will find peace.
One of the things I tell people, especially early on in coaching, is the best time to do something new, to start something new, especially if something new is important. Like I need to change something because I've been doing isn't working, and I need to do something different. Best time to do that is when it's hard. Because one of the things that I find, you'll hear me say this statement regularly, is that humans are comfort-seeking creatures. We're always seeking comfort. We're always looking for the comfortable. And when I hear you say the hermit, like that's what I hear. Like that's I want to do all the things so that I can go in and be comfortable, as if once those things are done, comfortable will be ever ending. Like it'll go on forever. And that just doesn't jive with how life actually works. And so one of the common things that people will say is, well, I'll start it when things get easy. And I'll say, well, that's one of the worst times to start something, because it's easy to do things new when they're easy. And as soon as things get hard, which they will, because that's how life works, then the first thing to go was the new thing that you just started when things were easy, and then it's gone. And the best time to do it is when it's hard, because if you can do it when it's hard and be successful doing it and maintaining it to where you develop it as a habit, you'll keep it when it's easy, but also as things stay hard, you know you can do it. You know you own it at that point. And so I focus on do it when it's hard, not when it's easy. I think that's also part of the reason why I'm naturally oriented towards comfort. I like comfort. But I also have an internal drive that is constantly seeking discomfort. I'm a little bit of a masochist. I want to be a little bit uncomfortable. When I get too comfortable, it makes me uncomfortable. And I think that's something that I've learned. I have not always been that way. I've learned to get uncomfortable when I'm too comfortable, because I know that that's not necessarily a good thing. Because once you get comfortable, you want to stay there. It's like, no, I can only enjoy this so long before I need to be moving on to what's coming next, which is eventually there's going to be some discomfort.
Yeah. What do you think about the word exchange and maybe even the ideology of it? Exchange.
Just off face value of the word by itself, I'm thinking quid pro quo, like they're tit for tat. We're getting you get something, I get something. I don't feel a whole lot more around it, unless you got more.
Do you think that life is about exchange? So this is something that I just read about in the book, and it's really just talking about that's always happening. And it got me thinking. It's like, you can break it down to elemental levels, and it's like we're breathing in oxygen, breathing out carbon dioxide, and then you can take that to like any direction you want to take into. There is exchanges happening.
Atoms are constantly exchanging electrons with one another. Like,
yeah.
What I heard when you brought in the book was transaction. Like, exchange is is life transactional? Is that what it means? Like, is that kind of the?
No, I think it's more. It's kind of. I kind of want to steer this conversation of exchange towards somewhat like doing hard things, doing things without expectations. It's like action-oriented thing without like expectations of things in return. And I think eventually when I get there, but I think I knew about all those things. I never looked at that from a point of view of an exchange, because even though I may do something and I may have an expectation of, earning something back and things like that, like there's an expectation of exchange. Even if you let that go, there's still an exchange that's happening that maybe is invisible to us.
So I hear sacrifice in there as well.
Yes, for sure.
Transactional is definitely a part of it. Gift. To gift, to receive, to give and receive is exchange. I think the first place you started with was just, oxygen, breathing in oxygen, letting go, releasing carbon dioxide.
From that point of view, we can even just say like, we are consumers. Like, it is okay, because that's literally what it means for us to have life, is that we consume oxygen, we consume food, we consume knowledge, things like that. Like, so I don't know, some might say that, man, like some might look down upon that, essentially, us being consumers.
No, we're consumers are that's what life is. Life consumes.
Yeah.
You can look at an ecosystem what is an ecosystem if it's not a system in which everything is extracting something and exchanging something? And generally, what one organism is extracting is what another is waste. The waste of one is the consumption of another, and then the waste of this one is the consumption of another, and that's what
the food chain and all that.
That's what keeps the ecosystem working.
Yeah. Ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're involved in an ecosystem, there is exchange taking place at all times. Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, we are consumers at a very basic level. Life consumes. All of life consumes. I mean, look at it. What is a plant doing to the soil if it's not extracting what it wants from it?
Mm-hmm.
It's consuming the sun. It is consuming the earth. It's consuming the rain when it falls on it. Consumption is something that is a base starting point of all things.
Mm-hmm.
So using being a consumer is a derogatory term at its base level is.
The premise isn't
Can we overconsume? Can we be out of balance with our consumption? Yes. Like I can put some judgment into that, but to have the judgment at the consumption level base as if we can turn that off. Well, I mean, if you don't want to be alive.
Right.
But even then, the decaying of our bodies, or is there still going to be an exchange going on in which there's consumption and waste taking place? So, I think it's easy to get usually around stuff like that with something specific to consumption, especially in the culture of how we talk about that. I'm usually going to hear like there's either an underlying ideology that is feeding that, a judgment. There's a judgment there, and there's an ideology that's very, very specific about the types of consumption, and it's very judgmental of you're consuming that particular type of thing.
So what do you think about it from a point of view of like the other things like sacrifice, action, like all of that, and then going back to the word exchange?
Sacrifice, I think, is a word that is not used enough in our culture and society. It's not given enough thought. I think it's something that is really at the heart of why we have what I consider a meaninglessness and purposelessness and loneliness crisis. Not just in our society, but really, I think largely around the world, that's especially in industrialized countries that have social media and advanced technology. It's an area where I would say there's overconsumption. We overconsume. We're out of balance with consumption. We don't recognize the ways in which we sacrifice naturally, inherently. We don't recognize the sacrifices that we make when we seek comfort at comfort's expense. Because life will get hard, and the more comfortable we make ourselves can make us less prepared for when life gets even harder. That's a sacrifice that we're making when we choose comfort, that we may endure a hardship that we can't overcome in the future. We're sacrificing our future for this current comfort. We can sacrifice for one another. A mother sacrifices for a child. The father sacrifices for a child. We sacrifice for our neighbors. We sacrifice for our community.
How do you do that when we exist in a society that it doesn't pay attention to that? It doesn't even, I will say, it doesn't value that. Is it just, you're just unsung hero?
No, I don't like the unsung hero.
Or worse, it's like
a martyr.
Or like, it's just like, you're just doing this and people are there to just take it back. Like, they will just mooch off of it.
I mean, it's always a risk.
Yeah.
I think it's how we value ourselves, how we value our sacrifice. If I put more conscious thought, effort, and intention into number one, being aware of my sacrifices, whether, like it's happening, whether I'm conscious of it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm conscious of it, I get to choose my sacrifices wisely. I don't just choose comfort for the sake of comfort, not knowing that down the road, I'm really going to be paying for that.
You're intentional about it.
I try to be very
aware and
intentional.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by being intentional, like, I'm less concerned about people taking advantage of my sacrifice. Because the things that I choose to sacrifice around, I know that I'm sacrificing for the betterment of other people, whether those people know it or not, whether they are taking advantage of it in good faith or in bad faith, they're getting value out of it regardless. And I have enough value in my sacrifice that I'm okay with that either way.
So when you say you have value in that sacrifice, meaning going back to this thing where you find value in, you first know that this is a sacrifice that you're doing. And then further, you're saying you actually value that. And so therefore that exchange, even though it may or may not have tangible, like, it's gonna go outwards, but it may not come inwards. Like tangibly, I'm talking about, you're like, it doesn't matter. I value it. It's good enough. And it's okay to give.
Well, part of recognizing the sacrifice is I have to recognize the whole. So what I might be sacrificing from the whole, I also recognize the whole. And I'm not sacrificing more of myself than I am willing, capable, or that's good for me.
Boundaries.
Right. So yeah, I definitely, so what I'm giving is what I can give. And so if somebody takes in bad faith, they're taking from something that is already free.
Yeah.
They're not taking from, they're not taking from a portion of me beyond what I'm already willing to give.
Yeah.
I think that's where people tend to feel taken advantage of. They're not
separation.
They're not conscious of their sacrifice.
Yeah.
They don't recognize the part that they're not sacrificing, and they tend to give too much. Or when people continue to ask, they don't have the boundary to say, that was what I had. And that, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. And I'm okay with maintaining this boundary. But if I'm making the sacrifice, I'm making the sacrifice. That is my choice. I'm choosing that willingly, knowing, you put out a dozen donuts, somebody, you say, have a sign, say, everybody just take one, and somebody takes three. It's like, I put the donuts out. As the donuts get eaten, I'm happy.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make a big deal about whether everybody followed the rules with them. What a terrible analogy, but
it's a good analogy to be like, you can't control outside of thisness. This portion of thing, you're like, hey, I am for the best part consciously doing this, and I'm doing this out of goodwill, and this is something I actually value. But then the rest you cannot. It's out of your control.
Yes, and then just to add one more part to the donuts, maybe nobody touches the donuts when donuts go stale, right? And say, no, nobody ate the donuts.
Control that.
It just goes in the trash. It's like, that was the sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that because I let go of it from the point that I made the offering.
It sounds like you also let go, like you maybe didn't have expectation to begin with in a specific way.
Well, so let's connect sacrifice to gift.
Mm-hmm.
A sacrifice is a gift. If, so, I love the concept of gift economy. It's something that I practice. And part of the reason that I fell into the practice of gift economy is because I was somebody who tended to overly sacrifice. I sacrifice with an expectation. I would sacrifice thinking I was going to get something in return. And I'll bring this into relationships. I was separated from my mom when I was 9 months old. I did not meet my mother until I was 18, almost 18. And so I, as a child, grew up not knowing what it was like to have a mom, to be raised with a mom, to have a maternal, nurturing, providing that type of care. I had mother figures who played incredible roles, but they were not able to be there in the way a mom would be there, in the same way that my son has a mom who's in his life. And so as I became an adult, getting into relationships, I was seeking out that I did not have, that I did not know. And I did not know, since I didn't know what it was, I didn't know how to get it, I tended to overly sacrifice, thinking that if I gave all of this of myself, that I would receive this mothering that I wanted. And this is all unconscious. I wasn't consciously thinking this stuff at the time, but I can see it very clearly in hindsight. And so I had to get to a point where I started really looking at the idea of what is a gift? What is that sacrifice? If I am giving, but I have expectations, is it actually a gift? If there's an expectation, it's not a gift. The whole idea of a gift is you give, it's given freely, and the other person, once it's handed off, the other person gets to do whatever they want. If you have some kind of strings attached, well, that's not a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of started me into the realm of gift economy. And as I got into gift economy, I realized, it is an exchange. It is not a gift if you are not able to also receive, right? If you are not open to receiving, when you give a gift, there is more than likely a string attached because you're not open to the receiving. You have an expectation of receiving something back.
The difference of you're not open to receiving, you have an expectation of receiving.
This one's challenging to articulate.
Verbalize, yeah.
And this was true for me. So maybe that's how I should preface this, is like, this was what was true for me, is recognizing I did not receive well. I was not, I would give, I'd bleed for people, but I was not willing to let people bleed for me. And in that became like, that is not a system of gift that is in balance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it sent me down a really interesting path of studying gift economy, studying money, studying currency, and seeing, understanding that gift economy is really the underlying economy in which all other economies exist on. Oxygen is free. Water is relatively free. Like, the land that we live on is free and abundant to us.
It's a gift to us.
It's a gift.
Yeah.
And we have put systems of economics on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would not work if that basic gift was not there.
Yeah. Or we would say, like, if we were to say, like, we don't want to receive, which could mean, like, this continent, we're not going to inhabit it or something. That would be like the equivalent of, like, we don't necessarily want to receive, to then even be able to, like, put all these economical, like, structures on top of it. But we don't do that. We like accept that all land and all the resources that is here for us in Earth.
Well, we have, but we've
and
also,
then on top of that, we'll put conditions and rules and all that. Yeah.
We placed ownership of certain things and made it mine, and we take it away from one another. But that system would not survive, it would not exist if there was not the basic system of gift economy that was underneath it.
Yeah.
And a great deal of human existence took place through the idea of gift economy. I think that money and currency became a way of exchanging gift. I give you shells, you give me beads.
Yeah.
And that was largely a display of friendship, of care. It probably came with other things that were also exchanged. It could have been physical labor, help,
Yeah, like generosity, sacrifice. You're actually giving perhaps these emotional things by doing the action.
Right. And then the physical things are a ceremony of that other exchange. They're a physical representation of it.
Yeah.
So, with as I got into gift economy more and more, I, was kind of recognizing like, well, how does money work? It works in, the dollar does not actually mean anything. It's just a piece of paper, but it's a part of currency that we all trust, that if I take that dollar and spend it, it goes off into the current.
Mm-hmm.
And if I continue to be somebody who produces value, it will come back in some other way. And gift economy works kind of the same way. If I sacrifice, the parts of myself that have value that aren't me, but I can let go of, and they are helpful to others, and I sacrifice that, and I am open that other people get to do the same thing, and then I get to receive. And that creates, that keeps the flow of gift economy moving. And, money gets to be a part of that exchange as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I read around this topic was that this idea of like exchange or expectations, like the tangibility of all of that, the premise around that of like getting gratification and things like that instantly, or whether something is good for you or something is not good for you, we're only really thinking about it from what we can see. We don't know if this, so to speak, good thing that's happening to you, if it's actually good for you like 60 years from now, or bad for you. We there's no way to know that. That's temporal dimension. The other dimension is what's good for you right now. Like largely we don't actually pay attention to whether it's good to the adjacent being next to us. Because this could be good, but oftentimes it could mean it's taking away from something else. And so there's so many of these dimensions that we have no control of. We can't even fathom to like be aware of these things. And so then what are you really left with? And what I read was like what you're left with is just doing, and like life as an experience. We talked about that in the previous episodes, and it's really just doing, acting, and I thought that was just really fascinating, and it definitely contradicts the systems that we live in, the capitalistic society that we live in, where there's tangible exchanges made all the time. You talk about the dollar, it's like technically because we trust that, like I can expend that dollar at a grocery food and I will know right then I can buy a banana with it. But if you leave away some of that tangibility, you start thinking about like abstract things or temporal things, and there's no trust, so to speak, that's tangible. You have to just imagine, or you have to believe, or maybe you have to have the faith.
That's a big word. Trust, faith.
Yeah.
Those are big words. Yeah. We don't realize how much faith we have to keep the world moving well.
I mean, outside and inwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because otherwise I think that as like, if I can't have the belief or the faith in the inner world, even in our inner world within me, it could start going down the path of like everything being pointless and all that.
Yeah. I mean, it's, the faith part gets even more interesting and curious because to sacrifice, I gotta reel in my thoughts a little bit because I can go a bunch of different directions. I grew up rather anti-religious. My father claimed to be atheist, although he was so angry at God. I kind of question that, because how can you be angry at something that you don't believe in? So I grew up not believing in God, or being very, very angry at God, and having a tremendous amount of judgment towards people who had any type of religion, and it didn't matter what type. A lot of judgment. But as I've gone through my my metamorphosis in life, I've had to come face to face with God, the concept of God, a belief in God, whether God exists or not. I don't necessarily have a belief in God, but I do have a sense that faith and spirituality are integral to our humanness. There is something that is like the glue that keeps us together, functioning as society. And even though we are in this kind of, post-God world in a lot of ways, especially in this country, there's a lot of faith that, like, there's a lot of religious language. There's a lot of like ideas of faith, ideas of trust, ideas of sacrifice that people are still behaving religiously, even if they don't believe in God. If that makes sense. I think there's something. I think there's something to our neurology in which we some kind of a connection to something that is higher than ourselves, and which requires faith and trust, is part of what allows us to have faith and trust in other humans. And the fact that we collectively have that is what allows us to have that with one another.
So I think that's something that's really cool, because this is described in the book as, with an analogy of a plant. A plant will have different fruits that have the same seeds. So those seeds are those trees themselves. They are separate, but they're still connected to the same tree. They can go on and become their own trees. So in that way, it's the same, but there's this connection that's happening. And I think we are a part of the same thing, where I think that's a connecting part between all beings. That could be elements, plants, animals, humans. And I think that concept is something that is not, it's immeasurable. And so we can't imply like scientific things, terminologies even, onto that, because it's imaginative, almost abstractive. We don't have the tools for it.
I think that's the part. We don't have the tools for it.
But that's still something that exists, a connecting point, a seed per se.
You talk about the trees, and it makes me want to talk about fungus.
Yeah, how it's connected underneath.
Yeah, the networks of the fungal networks that seem to be communication networks for trees to be able to communicate, that can send nutrients from one area to another area. I think the largest living organism is considered a big fungal network that's unfathomably large in acreage. I recently watched a video on a lichen. Are you familiar with the lichen? So lichen is all over the planet, except not in like deep oceans, and it's kind of its own little ecosystem. It's 3 or 4 species within one that there's different species of lichen, but each species of lichen has multiple species in it. And one of them is a fungus. I forget what the other 2 or 3 possibly are. My botany knowledge is very limited. But it's almost as if the fungus are agriculturally farming the other species, and they do it in a way in which creates its own lichen organism that can then replicate in its own species, but within that species, there's
3 or
more
4
species within it, which I find that like level of interconnectedness, ways in which of communication. There's something about that I find incredibly fascinating, because I think that there are ways in which we are connected, and we don't have the tools to be able to see it. One example is pair bonding, couple pair bonding. When a couple pair bonds, they're connecting at a neurological level. It's not physically tangible. You can't see it. You can't measure it, but it exists. And it exists in a way in which, if one of those two people is sad, sick, distressed, the other person can recognize it based on their neurological connection to one another that other people would not be able to notice. So I sense that there are ways in which we're connected, that exchange is constantly taking place.
Right.
And in going back to talking about things like sacrifice versus comfort, when we choose comfort over sacrifice, a lot of times we're not just choosing our own future sacrifice. We're also sacrificing others. Because when I choose sacrifice over comfort, I'm not just sacrificing for myself. I might be sacrificing for the sake of others. And it might be for the betterment of others, in a way in which others get to grow and be better. And if I'm choosing comfort over that sacrifice, not only am I hurting my future self, I'm also hurting the future selves of other people around me as well. And I think that's largely where we have gotten to in our cultures. We're disconnected from the fact that we're so connected. And we become so individualized that we don't recognize that we are also a part of a collective, and we choose their individual comforts. It's kind of the Marshmallow Test. I'm going to choose my immediate gratification and my immediate gratification and my immediate gratification, on and on and on. And I stop recognizing that I can actually choose the type of sacrifice. And I don't recognize that I'm choosing a sacrifice here. Like there is a sacrifice that's being made, but I'm unconscious to it. And if I was conscious to it, and I actually saw long-term that past my immediate gratification, that long-term, me and everybody else would be better if I chose this over that. My long-term comforts would actually be a lot better if I chose this over this.
It's fascinating to get to read about certain things from ancient scriptures that echoes a lot of the stuff they were talking about. And I think one of the things that I want to decouple is that I actually is the different levels of hierarchies, the pyramid system. And then come to find out, you told me that you don't know about the pyramid yet. Like that was something that I might have come up with, but I'd love to kind of dive into that with additional context. So in this book, it's an interpretation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. So I'm not reading the Gita, I'm reading an interpretation of it and its context from life. And so I learned that it is described in that scripture that human experiences can be divided into containers. And so the containers being that first container is the body. Let me really try to summarize this to the best of my ability. First container is the body. Within that container is the breath. Breath is what mobilizes the limbs, the bodies. within the container of the breath are is the mind. And so that has to do with like intellectual things, but it could also mean conceptual things like ideologies and whatnot. I think thoughts is one of them too. And then you can kind of go deeper and deeper. And so it's body, breath, thoughts, belief, and something else. And it's fascinating to see a close connection with the layers that we talk about, which is physical, mental, intellectual, emotional, spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
So in this containerization thing, the mention of spiritual does not exist, but it really just further breaks down the mental, intellectual, and emotional into just close-like things. And it's like really interesting because it also talked about how it kind of divided the beings that we have on the planet. And I didn't even know that the symbolism of swastika is represented by these four things, which are elements, plants, animals, and humans. And the way that's divided is that elements do not, let me think about it, plants. Elements do not, they don't feel and things like that, like the way we can measure, or like they can't communicate things like that. So we don't know what their experiences are of life. Then you go into plants. Those are the things that can feel things. They can actually react to certain things like sunlight. And it's consumer, going back to what we're talking about. It can consume nutrients. It can consume sunlight, but they're immobile. So then you have the immobile and then the mobile. So mobile would be like animals and humans. And so the animals are the ones that are able to like react to certain things. You know, they go look for food. They have fear. That's what they're fearing. They have the fear of death. And then you can break down, like you can separate animals from humans. And the separator is really this imagination part, that animals largely are not able to like imagine things or look at things from an observer point of view or think about like imaginative life of like, there's immortality or like there's life after death, things like that. Like animals might not necessarily be able to do that, but it's the humans who are consumers. They're mobile, but they also have this layer of imagination that separates from the different species and the beings. And I just find that it's so convoluted when it comes to with that. It's like with great powers comes great responsibilities. Is with that great power of being able to imagine, we have the power to actually change these different levels. Like we have that, we can actually we have the power to change how our thoughts happen. So it's like our thoughts can change our emotions, but the emotions have the ability to change thoughts. And so there's like a loop, like an ever-going loop that's happening. And that complexity is something that I'm still trying to break it down and learn. And I guess you can say like, I'm trying to learn that concept, right? But it's like my emotions can control my concepts, but my concepts can actually control my emotions as well. And I find that kind of fascinating because what I think of that as is if I learn these things of like, oh, this is what anger shows up as and all these things, I'm conceptually learning certain things. And why am I learning that? Maybe it's to understand it. Maybe it's to then eventually be able to then control my emotional state, or not necessarily control it, but
Right. I'd be cautious of that word.
yeah, I guess you probably can't control it, but it's like, I think you can still filter some of that like how that emotional thing shows up on your physical, like in the physical state.
I would think that, my metaphor for emotions would be fire. Do we really control fire, or do we kind of manage it? Right? We've gotten really good at managing, but at the same time, when fire takes hold, it can be out of control. I mean, fires in LA are an example of that. I think it's the same thing for emotions. Emotions influence our thoughts. We can control our thoughts to a degree.
Yeah.
Up to the point where emotions influence them. And then we can manage our emotions. But manage is not control, because sometimes our emotions will be beyond our ability to control, and managing is a matter of like trying to prevent the fire from spreading, right? It's still burning shit down.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that as filtering, really. It's like certain lens that we're able to like look past that information through.
And I think that's an important subtle distinction, because I don't think the idea, the languaging of controlling our emotions can lead to bad outcomes for people.
Yeah.
Because it's like they're trying to push their emotions into this thing that they think that is going to be strong enough to contain it.
Yeah, they have a hold of.
That they got a hold of. And they may they may spend 20, 30 years controlling that. And eventually it's just creating more pressure. It's just pressurized. And the greater the pressure, the bigger the explosion. So they might be controlling it in the interim, but at some point it's going to be out of control. I'd put that into I'm comfortable now, but I don't know what the sacrifice I might be giving up later. And I know a lot of people that control their emotions in a way in which they don't actually feel things, and they're missing out on experiences, on the emotional experience of things.
Yeah.
And they're likely to overreact when they lose control of it. Managing it allows us to have a little bit of an area in which we need to be able to be out of control of it. We need to be able to unleash it at times that are safe compared to times that are unsafe. If I'm constantly controlling it, I don't know when it's going to blow. But if I have outlets for it, then I can continue to kind of let some of that steam off, so that I know that I have a place for this to go.
I think if anything, in that distinguishment that you're making here of control, is that if the elements, so fire could be an element where it is not seeking certain things. It's like once oxygen goes out, it will just die off. And we don't perceive like, oh, now it's suffering or it died. But I think because we're humans and we have all of these layerings and containers, it almost feels like people may want to have this ability to control the fire and stuff like that. But it's only if we can actually look at it from that elemental point of view, where it's like maybe certain things will be different when there's oxygen, but then it could just also die out if you let it.
Well, and then the question is like, does that, you may no longer have flames over there, but all it takes is a spark.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, but the container stuff, it's just like, we just see the two layers. We can only interact with two layers. Then the rest is like, it goes into that imagination part. It goes into like perceivedness. I don't know. And like, does the notion of observing ourselves and all that comes from that too. And the thing of the seeds and connecting with one another, it all comes from that too, because that level of thing, I think we all have. Like, we may not be attuned to it, some might be, but there is a point of connection into that.
So you kind of talking about how like for the most part, we are capable of managing a small number of things at a time, right? Contradictory, challenge, like the things in our life that we think we have control over, we have some level of control over, or that we're out of control over. We can only manage a small number of those things at a time. And there's a point where it gets too big, gets too complex. Life is filled with infinite complexities.
Dimensions, all of that. Yeah.
I want to change that and make it more of a spectrum. And I want to think about it in terms of sympathetic nervous system, states of fight or flight, and parasympathetic being states of rest and restore. And that's a spectrum that we're constantly always on. And for the most part, we are always a little bit elevated into sympathetic nervous system. I think a modern human, you wake up in the morning, you pick up your phone, get bad news, you're watching, you're putting on the, radio first thing, all you're hearing is how bad things are. You're already going into sympathetic nervous system. So in these two states, our field of vision changes. The more sympathetic our nervous system, the more tunnel vision we get. So the more narrow the number of parameters that we're able to deal with and digest and take in and manage are going to be narrow. And part of that is because sympathetic nervous system is there to prepare us for, there's bear jumps out in front of us in front of the woods. We don't need a broad perspective of the world right now. We need a very narrow one. We got to deal with the bear. If we're in more of the rest and, more rest and restore state, our vision gets to open up and we can take in more and we can see more of the infinite complexity. We're not going to see it all. Nobody's capable of that, but we can see more. So there is a spectrum of which we can improve our field of vision to be able to see things that might have formerly been outside of our field of vision. And things that might be even outside of us, to be able to notice what might be taking place for somebody else, how they're dealing with it, how I might be impacting them, how I might be impacting them, and then they're impacting someone else. Like that's like really being able to broaden it out. Those are things that we can actually improve. We can get better up to a point. But it largely depends on where we are in our sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system. Again, most people, we wake up in the morning and we're already elevated. We already are long-term. I will even go a step further and say that this elevation in sympathetic nervous system is part of the reason that we seek comfort. Short-term comfort versus long-term benefit. Because when our field of vision shrinks, then we see the marshmallow in front. Are you familiar with the marshmallow test?
No.
Okay.
I think I'm getting the gist of
marshmallows, real quick. Marshmallow test. They put little kids in a room. They put a marshmallow in front of them. They said, we're going to walk out for 15 minutes. If we come back and you have not eaten that marshmallow, you'll get 2 marshmallows. And so they put a marshmallow in front. The kids who were, they have kids that were just like, they die. Like 5 minutes go by and they start picking at it. And the next thing you know, they gobble it up and they eat it. Other kids sit in the room, have no problem sitting there patiently looking at it and just, figure out a way to distract themselves. 15 minutes go by, they don't eat it. And this was done decades ago. So they were able to follow these same kids over time. And the kids that gobbled up the marshmallow right off the bat, they had difficulty with impulse control, short-term comforts over long-term benefit. And the kids that were able to withhold eating the marshmallow and got 2 tended to have better outcomes in their life.
Yeah.
So marshmallow, I suspect that so when we go into a sympathetic nervous system state, we lose some of the blood flow into our frontal cortex, which is our mammalian brain. Going back to the animals, we have a reptilian brain, we have a mammalian brain, and then we have a human brain. And those are all evolutionary. You can go back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and you can see how that evolution developed to the point where we are now a little bit separate from other animals in the way that is very human. So when we go into sympathetic nervous system, we lose blood flow to the frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex is our ability to see out into the future and make long-term decisions based on long-term. And again, bear jumps out in front of us. I don't need my frontal cortex. I got a bear. I need my blood flow going to taking care of this bear. Now, if we are in a sympathetic state, as if there's a bear in front of us all the time, then that means we wake up in the morning, boom, we're already here. And our ability to think long term is already regressed. And so we're going to be making decisions from a more ancient part of our brain that is more based on immediate gratification.
Mhm.
Just naturally, we're going to have that tunnel vision. We're not going to be able to see the sacrifices that we're making over here. That's something that we can get better at. We can work on our moving more into this parasympathetic state and trying to maintain that throughout the day, even with the extreme stresses that we may experience in our day-to-day lives, that it is something possible. And by doing that, start to see a bigger field of vision and start to recognize how our interactions and our sacrifices not only impact us, but also the people around us.
I think that's the thing that I was wanting to say is like, it's through that filtering. Like, I think we are able to filter certain information to rev up that towards the frontal cortex, like thinking. I do think that, and I think that we have the power to do that kind of training and exercise also. And I think the best that I could think of is like having access to that through breath.
Yeah. I mean, what I just talked about, is one of the main reasons that I teach what I teach. It's what changed, it's something that has changed my life. And I imagine that if we could get millions of people to do the work on maintaining more of a parasympathetic state by doing their process work, starts with breath, movement,
Mm-hmm.
Paying attention, becoming the observer, that more and more people doing that, you raise the level of people having greater access to their full consciousness, making decisions based on a larger field of vision versus tunnel vision, being able to make better decisions for their individual lives. They'll make better decisions, but that will manifest into a collective where we see better decision making in our politics and our culture across the board. That is the reason I teach what I teach.
It's really basically like talking about elements, plants, animals, humans. It's like with this thing that you're talking about with constant news and being in the fight or flight mode, we are way closer to being like an animal than living our true potential as human beings with the gifts that we have.
I mean, and I think that sometimes we also have to remind ourselves that we are also very much animals. We're just great apes.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things to do is to to observe, go out into the world and just sit and observe as if you're at the zoo and watch the animals in the zoo. And at the same time, having the awareness that you're inside the zoo and you are also one of them. There's so much about how we behave that is just simply animals in nature. We like to think that because we're human, we're doing something that's different than all the other animals, but you look at people and they're doing a lot of just instinctual animal behavior most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes back to the word control because, like, I think actually our video just went out today. It was talking about anger, and it's like we need that. Like, it serves us, and so in this scenario where like you could be faced with a bear one day, and so that's where you need that instinct, for sure. But it goes back to the word control, where we're not trying to control to always be in this long-term thinking state.
Yeah. Sympathetic state, nervous system state is not something I'm trying to avoid. But it is something that I want to be well conditioned and trained and have as much of my own observer understanding of. You know, I like working with people who are first responders, or I'll take my best friend as an example. Ex-Navy SEAL, ex-firefighter. I grew up with him, known him since I was 5. He's always been one of those people who, if there's an emergency, not only is he a first responder, but he is able to show up and be calm. And I don't mean calm in the sense of chill. I mean, like, he brings a calmness of action. He knows, like, he can say, go do this, and people respond because he is in a place of calm and there's a sense of authority in the way that he does it. Some of that he's gotten better at because of training. Mm-hmm. Like, when you go through SEALs training, you go through firefighting training, you prepare for the worst case scenarios, so that when you're in the worst case scenario and you're in your sympathetic nervous state, you still have access to your training, which helps to keep you a little bit over here, so you don't lose all of this. Mm-hmm. You can bring some of it with you. You can still see the larger view. That is like, I want to be aware of my sympathetic state. I want to be aware when I'm in it, and I don't need to be in it, so that I'm working to be here, because I don't want to be stressed when I don't need to be stressed. If I'm stressed all the time, my body's going to be producing cortisol and other hormones that aren't necessarily good for me, especially in high doses over long periods of time. So I want to reduce it, but at the same time, I don't want to avoid it. There's times where I actually want to stimulate and be in my sympathetic state, because I need to train that state, because in the worst case scenario, that's the state I'm going to be in, and I want to be well trained for it. I don't know. I don't remember exactly what brought that up to connect it to, but that felt relevant.
Would you say that, like, just naturally, I mean, you wake up and you see the sunlight in your eyes, you're like the reduction of melatonin and all of that stuff, like, does that relate to, like, basically, like, we have the rest and sleep, like, cycle that almost, like, closely matches that of light, the sunlight, like, and things like that. Like, does that all, it's, I feel like it's also stimulating these things too. It's really like just doing that. And so even though you may not be like checking your phone in the morning, like, just the fact that you're seeing that it's morning, there's sunlight, like, you're in that arousal state of, like, let's get up and get to your day.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not like we don't want to be in this state. I mean, like, you're going to be in that state. We're talking about levels of it, because you talked about it as a spectrum.
Well, that's the reason I want to talk about a spectrum, because you will always be somewhere on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And where you are on that spectrum, am I here when I should be over here? Well, that's a problem. Yeah. Am I always overly excited, always stressed, always worried, always in my short term? And if I'm there, am I constantly looking for comfort? Because that's a really stressful place. It's going to make me seek out comfort, because I'm exhausted by it all the time. Am I overly in this state and have no training over here, so that I'm ill prepared? Something happens and I'm going to be a victim to it because I don't know how to respond. We are somewhere on that spectrum all the time.
This is the part that's, like, for me, as a person who wants to break things down and, like, really understand the conceptual nature of it, ideology, whatever you want to call it. But that part is so convoluted in my brain, because it is convoluted, right? Where those things can impact your observer self, but your observer selves can impact those things also on that scale. And like that kind of loop is just like, it's so fascinating to me. Because we can look at I can look at what time it is right now, and it somehow impacted something deep within.
Mm-hmm.
But from something within, I could look at, and I could evoke something where it's like the concept of time is irrelevant, or it's just something like that. And that kind of impact, I wanted to say control, that kind of control, but it doesn't. That's not the word we want to use here. That kind of impact that we can have, that kind of influence we can have on just our own action is like, it feels a lot. Like it feels like there's so much power at our own hand.
Yeah. We have more power than we think we do.
Yeah.
I mean, just the power of the voice by itself is so much. Control. I want to dive into that word just a little bit real quick, because I have a thing that I tell people. There's only one thing that any human being actually has control over. We can't control other people. We can't control the environment. There's so little control. We don't have control to how our body responds to things. We don't have control over our emotions. The only thing that we have control over is, it's not how we respond to things. It is how we respond to how we respond to things. That is the only place that we have any sense of control.
And I think that's the part where I find myself wanting to learn about these ideologies and concepts and things like that, because that is so that I can control the response that I'm going to have in certain situations or something like that. Not control, but like,
Well, I mean, I think, no.
It is, yeah.
That's
the only thing that I could have control.
To control how you respond to how you respond. And I think a simple way of describing what I mean by that is being the observer to how you respond to things. Because I think when you read ancient texts from different cultures, there's one thing that's usually fairly in common, and that is going to be some concept of an observer.
Yeah.
Like being an observer to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're an observer to yourself, you get to witness how you respond to things, which is where then you have the ability to change how you respond to how you respond to things. Oh, I notice when that happens that my anger gets provoked. Okay, well, that thing's going to happen and the anger is going to get provoked. I can't change that part. But as I see the anger provoked, I can change how I respond to that anger. Instead of just letting it out and letting it fly and flinging angry things towards other people or towards myself, I can take some deep breaths. I can check in and be like, okay, that's sending me here. Can I come back to here? And can I think clearly? And how is the appropriate way for me to respond, knowing that, like, with this anger coming up, that changes how I respond to other people, mm-hmm. to situations. And the better I get at it, the faster I can get at it.
Yeah.
Early on, it's like anger flares up and it can take me a few days of observing before I trace it back to that thing. But the earlier I trace it back, or the earlier I'm able to, the more I recognize it, the sooner I'm able to catch it. I actually have an analogy for this that I came up with recently. And that is an analogy for a trigger. What is a trigger? I think I might have talked to you about this. That a trigger is a script. It is a story. It has a cast of characters. It has its own narrative. And it's a trigger in which, when that same thing gets triggered, the same story comes up. And it might be a story that has been being reenacted for like a decade or more. And so my analogy for it is that script is like a movie. So, if the trigger is fear, the movie is a scary movie. And the scary movie, you can imagine like there's the person, the character on the film, they're going into the woods and you're like, oh, don't go in the woods. If you go in the woods, you're going to die and you can't control the person. They're just going to go in the woods, and they go in the woods and there's a house. And you're like, oh, don't go to that dark house. If you go to the dark house, you're going to die. Person goes onto the house and they go open the door. You're like, don't open the door. Don't go into the house. And they walk into the house, right? And you're just following along this. You're out. You can't control it because the story, once it's triggered, it's going to go all the way through till the end. And then you see the slaughter and you're like, oh, we know the story because we've seen it before. And as if we play the observer, we can start to recognize, oh, I'm in a story. I'm in that, I'm in that triggered state, and we can stop the story right there. And
or at least you could be aware, even if
it starts with being aware.
Out.
Well, it starts with being aware.
Yeah.
But over time, as we're aware, we can actually stop. We can say, I don't want to continue this. And
even if the movie's gonna play.
The movie, it
right,
wants to keep, I can stop the script and instead reorient myself. And it's not just stopping and moving on. I would call that bypassing. It's stopping and saying, okay, I'm triggered. What is the emotion that is underneath this trigger? It's a scary movie. It's fear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I've named it. I've named the emotion, and now I can do some breath work and I can breathe in, and I can get to a point where I feel like I'm surrendering that fear. This is the idea where when we get triggered, when fear gets triggered, it creates a chemical that cascades and floods the bloodstream. And the sooner I can get to deep breaths, I can dilute that with oxygen and get that to get filtered back out of my body so that I'm less in a fear state. Because as that chemical is moving through my body, it's literally impacting every cell of my body, almost vibrationally. You can feel fear. And the sooner I can breathe, I can get underneath it and I can get back to a neutral state. And so I can start to, so if you think of like, if I play the movie all the way out, then I am flexing the neurology of that entire movie. Mm-hmm. And the sooner I can get to this point, I'm bringing in a new type of neurology. And I can get closer and closer to the moment that I was triggered, to where I feel fear. I feel the fear before the movie even starts playing, and I can get to it then. Breathe. I'm still going to feel it. It still has to go through its chemical cascade in my body, but I can move through it quicker. And because I'm aware of it, I can also be in this conscious state of, I'm processing fear. Mm-hmm. It's going to impact my decision making right now. So maybe now is not the best place to make important decisions. And if I have to make a decision right now based on where I'm at, then I can make a more thoughtful decision than I would if I was allowing it to play out without awareness and without being conscious to it.
Yeah.
And you can replace fear, the scary movie, with judgment. Judgment is generally, people will experience that as like the judgment of God, or the judgment of an authority, the judgment of a parent. Like, it's a biblical story. That's a movie of like, Moses going up to the mountain. Like, it's got its own narrative, characters, storyline, and it's like if you are facing a judgmental God or a judgmental parent in your mind, and you can get to the point where you see that script, you can get to, oh, there's judgment, or you have an anger.
It's still trigger, right? It's just a different feeling. It's just trigger, but we went from anger to judgment. And
anger, judgment, fear, insecurity, anxiety, all of the emotions any emotion that is not love or neutrality.
So this basically sounds like anytime we have a storyline, like this is what's happening.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
but
most of the times.
I would say all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so let's back up.
Not all of it is bad.
Not all of it is bad. Let's back up a little bit, and even let's define triggers a little bit more. Trigger's not a bad thing either.
Yeah.
There's a lot of triggers that we have that make our understanding of the world better. What would be a good example? I see a glass, it's got water in it. I don't have to inspect the glass. I don't have to sniff the water every time. The visual reference of it triggers what that is as a meaning for me. Most of the things that we have are patterns that we trigger something very specific, and that's happening all the time.
Yeah.
And there's positive triggers. I mean, you think of laughter. Can you control laughter? Sometimes you can kind of, but if somebody says something really funny, you just burst out loud. That's a trigger too.
Yeah.
So being triggered is not necessarily a bad thing. It's more a matter of, am I in this sympathetic state that leads me into, I'm filtering things through fear. I'm filtering things through anger. Like the longer I let that movie play out, and when a fear gets triggered, it can last for a few minutes. It can last for days.
Yeah.
It can last for weeks. I know people who just stay in that triggered state. And if you have that fear flooding your body, affecting your ability to see the world, you're making decisions with that fear every day. Are those decisions going to lead to the best outcomes compared to not being in a fear state, or an anger state?
Yeah.
I think that most times that people do things that are regretful, it's because they're triggered emotionally in a sympathetic state that they've lost that ability to see long term. They got tunnel vision, and it feels very real and relevant in the moment because of how you feel. And those are the decisions that we tend to make, that we tend to regret the most.
Yeah, because I mean, that person could be in a movie without really realizing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was for a long time.
Yeah. I think the thing about what we have control over is the ability to respond how we respond. That also made me realize of like your friend who they had the control to condition themselves in those certain specific situations where they can throttle back a little bit so they can have that long-term vision. So that is the control that person did have, and it's through conditioning that they were able to do that kind of like act a certain way in those moments.
Yeah.
But they still can't control how it's all going to turn out.
No.
Right. They can just do their best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd say a good amount of that's training. Some of that's just, some people just come into the world built to be first responders.
Yeah. That's true. Anything else?
I felt pretty good today. Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, you made it all the way through. Thank you for watching. Really appreciate your support. We'll see you in the next month. Thank you. This is Smith, tuning out of TAOTalks.